Hello and welcome to the Six Pillar Podcast, hosted by Chief Neil Gang and proudly produced by Techna Innovations. I'm Cherylynn Finstad, CXO at Techna Innovations, and for today's episode, I'm honored to introduce you to our very special guest, Dr. Cherylynn Lee. Dr. Lee is a police psychologist leading the Behavioral Sciences Unit at the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Office. She also serves on crisis negotiation teams and instructs for the FBI in mental health and officer wellness. Additionally, Dr. Lee teaches officer wellness for California Peace Officers Standards and Training and has been recognized as one of IACP's 40 Under 40 for 2023, as well as CIT International's Behavioral Health Practitioner of the Year for 2024. Dr. Lee, welcome to the Six Pillar Podcast. Chief Gang, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Well, welcome to the Six Pillar Podcast. I want to thank our team at Techna Innovations, our technical director and producer, Matt Krell, and also Cherylynn Finstad, our new Chief Experience Officer, or in the business world, CXO. I just have to talk about this team for a moment, if you don't mind. Techna Innovations offers so many good things. If you're looking to do a podcast, you're looking to do some mobile app development, reach out to them. They have integrated media solutions from mobile app developments, podcasting. They do branding, social media support, websites, book publishing. So if that's something that interests any of our listeners, reach out to Matt or Cherylynn, and they'll be able to set you up. What a great team, what a supportive team, and I couldn't be doing what we're doing without them. So welcome to the Six Pillar family. We have unfiltered conversations about leadership, organizational wellness, as we all know, absent of the buzzwords and bullshit we hear all over the place. So people ask sometimes, what is the Six Pillar Podcast and how we named it that? Well, the sixth pillar was the sixth pillar of the 21st century policing model, which was officer wellness and resiliency. As our listeners know, I always start off faith-based with a Bible verse, and I think this one really hits home today. And it's comes from John 8, which is 32-34. And it says, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." How that's going to apply today is Dr. Lee is going to take us to trauma school today. We're actually going to be able to learn what PTSD is, what PTSI is, what the difference is, why perhaps our first responders are being diagnosed with PTSD when they don't have it. So the truth will set people free today. I'm really excited about having her with me. And I'm going to start off with a quote that I heard. We have 40 million reasons for failure, but not a single excuse. Now, Dr. Lee, you don't know right now, you can't see her, is smiling because she knows I just stole that from her LinkedIn page this morning.
The quick turnaround, Chief.
The quick turnaround. So kind of a joke, but as we kick this off, I just want to thank you for being here and also congratulate you on the IACP 40x40 award that you just were bestowed upon. So talk a little bit about the audience of what that is and talk a little bit about that award you just won.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. So the 40 Under 40 award, I was the recipient of that last year. So in 2023. And IACP, we know, is International Association of Chiefs of Police. Generally speaking, they nominate civilian and sworn personnel from across the nation and other countries as well in the policing profession. And they highlight what they determine to be future leaders. So folks that are sort of thinking outside the box, doing something a little bit different and contributing to the profession or the field in an innovative way. So I was honored to be the recipient of that award and be recognized for the work that I'm doing.
Very nice. And super deserving, by the way. Dr. Lee and I have interacted for the last couple of years. We've traveled and crossed paths, spoke at different events together. In fact, we just had two events back to back last month where we saw each other and spoke at the same event. I just have to talk about something for a minute. And since we have Dr. Lee with us here today, I have to share a little story. It's a trauma story. So I was recently traveling. I was going to Palm Springs and I went to the Southwest counter. And of course, I'm in a rush and I throw my bag up there and it's 62.5 pounds. Yikes. Right. So I'm looking at the attendant and she looks at me and with like a disgusted look. And I'm like, okay, don't take it personal. Right. So she says, well, I have to charge you $100. And I go, $100? I go, that's a lot. She goes, unless you could take, 12.5 pounds out of here and put it in your bag. I looked at her and I had a backpack. I go, I'm not taking 12.5 pounds, put it in here. So go ahead and charge me. However, I said, don't we get 2 free bags? And she said, you do. And I go, and what's the poundage of the bags? And she said, 50 each. I said, well, my calculations, you kind of owe me 37.5 pounds. And she did find that very funny and decided she was going to call a supervisor over. But that's my little Southwest story. So Yeah, I was traumatized by that experience.
Rightfully so. That sounds stressful. Mhm.
It was,
I mean, you have to do math on the fly. That's terrible. That's
yeah,
awful.
I had to take my shoes off. So, but one of the biggest lies I think that our first responders face beyond the whole, recruitment and retention is the biggest issue facing our profession, which people know and our listeners know that I argue that all the time, is that
Mhm.
everybody, all our first responders are diagnosed with PTSD. I know that you have a saying, it's okay not to be okay, but it's also not okay to stay that way. Well, I also
Right.
have a saying, and it's okay to be okay, and talk about that we don't have to leave limping out of this profession. We don't all have to leave scarred, that we can do things and be resilient and put things in place to actually leave healthy. So, Dr. Lee, I'm going to ask you to take us to school. Tell us a little bit about PTSI versus PTSD, and what is post-traumatic stress injury that everybody talks about?
Sure. So I think to address your point that sometimes folks think that they have to have PTS or PTSD in order to be an officer, or you're an officer and you're inevitably going to get it. That is not the case at all. And in fact, sometimes when I present and keynote speak on post-traumatic stress injury, folks will come up to me afterwards and say, "Hey doc, I'm not stuck. Does that mean I'm super fat because I should have been more, you know, like I'm not checking all the boxes that you're saying my colleagues are checking. So is there something extra wrong with me?" I have to let them know, no, it's okay that you're not experiencing these things, but here's this information, here's the symptoms, here are the indicators, so that should you notice you start to, you can do something about it. I think that in this profession, at some point, everybody's going to contend with some of the symptoms of PTSI, right, or PTSD. So whether that's anxiety or beating yourself up in your own mind, intrusive thoughts, intrusive images, trouble sleeping. I mean, some of that is just because of shift work in and of itself. And some of the symptoms, I suppose, overlap. But no, not everybody's going to walk out of this profession limping. And I think that's a misnomer. We need to kind of move away from that. We need to give people the tools to be okay and the tools to navigate if they're not.
Very good. I know that I just recently saw you at the California Police Chiefs Wellness Summit, and I think you were the first, doctor to actually talk about that PTSD sometimes is a coding for therapists to actually get funding or to get paid, and that inadvertently people label some of our first responders with PTSD. Can you talk a little bit about that, because that's so important? Because what happens is they go and they want to seek help. The first responder goes out and seeks help, and they walk away going, okay, I just got labeled with PTSD. And I think it just starts people spiraling, like, now I have to leave the profession. So talk a little bit about that and maybe just kind of clarify what you're seeing and how this is all kind of having a negative effect on some of our first responders.
Sure. So generally speaking, I think when we're talking about trauma, we have three buckets and ways that we can talk about it. We can talk about stress and trauma, we can talk about PTSI, and we can talk about PTSD. Ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, everybody's going to have symptoms of stress and everybody's dealing with trauma if you're an officer or dispatcher. So to some extent, that's just going to be a part of what happens. PTSD is a formal clinical diagnosis that you have to get from a licensed practitioner. And what that means is that you have enough symptoms over a particular period of time that now cause you to be bent in some way. A lot of patients come in and they call themselves broken. And I say, no, it's more like bent. So, off in some way. When I use the phrase PTSI, what that refers to is the biological impact of trauma on the brain. That is the reason for some of the symptoms that we see. So ultimately, post-traumatic stress injury is a more appropriate way to categorize what it is officers experience as a result of what they digest on the job. Disorder, just the word itself, carries a stigma to it. It feels like it's a character flaw. It feels like there's a weakness associated with it. A disorder means there's something wrong with you. And that's absolutely not the case. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, when we use the word disorder, that doesn't sound very good. Folks often think that that's associated with weakness or a character flaw or something is wrong with them. In this world and in this profession, you don't just get to say, I think I'll have all these symptoms and I think I won't be okay. And I'm going to go ahead and order that for myself. You have to earn it. You have to put in the work in order to be somebody that suffers with the symptoms that I often see folks navigate in my office. Post-traumatic stress injury is a more appropriate term because ultimately stress and trauma lead to biological changes that happen in the brain that are some of the reasons why we see the symptoms that we do. Like, for example, oftentimes I'll work with officers that are just coming off of a critical incident. Some of the most stressful time that they have is they can't remember all the details of the incident. They can't remember how they got there. They can't remember when they started rendering medical aid, or they can't remember, did they have a conscious thought about cutting the rope when the person jumped off the bridge, and so on. Memory is associated with a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And so when we can relate a symptom where somebody says they feel like they're going crazy to a biological function, now we've taken out the mystery and we can tell them, hey, you're not going crazy. Your brain is responding in exactly the way that it should to the incident or accumulation of incidents that you've had to deal with.
I think it's so important that people just understand these terminologies because, like I said, I think first responders want help. They go get help and it's already explained and they're just labeled with this disorder. And like you said, disorder, right? You're already a stigma behind that. The minute that word, then they walk away from these and go, oh, why did I even raise my hand to get help? I just got stigmatized with this disorder, and immediately they think it's time to retire. They don't understand how the brain works, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But the brain is a muscle, if I understand it, and you can actually rehab that muscle and actually go back to work and be healthy and have a terrific career and be able to leave here and go into retirement without being affected by those things long term.
Yeah. So in my office, so I specialize in trauma. I have a private practice. I only see first responders, mostly cops, DA investigators, and dispatchers. I specialize with the guys and gals that should have been in my office 15 years ago. And most of them, if not all of them, have PTSI. And we talk about that. Sometimes I write people out of work. Sometimes I'm helping fill out workers' comp paperwork. Sometimes they need certain letters to recoup costs from their insurance company. When I'm filling out documentation, I have to write post-traumatic stress disorder. Because by definition, by clinical definition, that's what it is, and that's what's needed to be reimbursed for billing. Not all practitioners understand how important that nuance is to the person that they're seeing. So what I don't want is, somebody to see, post-traumatic stress disorder and me not explain to them what the difference is and what that means. And like you said, they walk away feeling like maybe they can't go back to the job. Maybe something's always going to be wrong with them. Maybe, they're not a good fit. And that's not the case at all. I have had several folks in my private practice where they've suffered with PTSI fairly acutely, and we get through it, we do the work, and they're promoting. And we get through it, we do the work, and they're thriving, and they're bringing their experience to their own organization as they sort of grow up and promote and are doing things differently for the officers below. That, I think, is the ultimate way to pay forward when it comes to wellness. You asked about the brain. So the hippocampus is part of a grouping of structures called the limbic system. There's three primary structures. There's the amygdala, hippocampus, and frontal lobe. Like we talked about briefly, the hippocampus is responsible for memory, and it's also responsible for where emotionally salient memories get stored. So emotionally salient, things that are sad or that make you angry, or where there's a lot of fear maybe potentially associated, or disgust potentially associated with an experience, those kind of memories tend to get stored in the hippocampus. After exposure to trauma over a period of time, whether it's incidental, there was one big thing that happened, or multiple things over time that happened, what we can see is that part of the brain shrinks over time. The cells aren't wiring and firing as they used to. The actual structure of that part of the brain gets smaller. Second structure, called the amygdala, is a part of the brain that's responsible for fight or flight. It's where emotions essentially come from. It is where hypervigilance comes from. It is a really important part of the brain for humans, and an even more important part of the brain for cops, right? You think about hypervigilance and situational awareness, that's huge. What happens over time in response to, again, incidental or cumulative trauma is that part of the brain actually gets bigger. In some cases, that part of the brain can double in size. So sometimes, I get guys or gals in my office that say, I used to be able to go to Disneyland. I can't. I used to be able to go to the carnival. I can't. I hear a dog barking at 3:00 in the morning, and now they're sitting looking outside their bedroom window with their gun out because they thought they saw a shadow, right? That's hypervigilance. That is directly related to that part of the brain that got bigger. And so that's why oftentimes in law enforcement, we see folks a little bit more fearful or suspect of people, places, and things. Not necessarily because there's more danger in the world than before they started the job, but because their brain has changed and they're seeing the world a little bit differently, right, wrong, or indifferent. And the third part of the brain is that frontal lobe. That's where impulse control lives. That's where metacognition, thinking about thinking, lives. It's what separates us from other creatures, all that kind of stuff. It's what makes humans human. What happens over time is that part of the brain doesn't function as well, doesn't function as quickly. It sort of gets dull. And so you're not making decisions as quickly as you used to. Maybe you're second guessing yourself a little bit more. Maybe you're starting to make silly decisions. You're having impulse control problems, and now there's substance abuse issues or infidelity issues or whatever the case is. So when we say injury, we're talking about those parts of the brain that change over time. Because of the way they change, we see the symptoms or indicators that we do. So it's really powerful when I have an officer in my office and I can tell them, hey, there's nothing wrong with you. This is happening because you're good at your job. Think about it. Have you ever drank a lot of water?
Of course.
You ever drank so much water that you really had to go to the bathroom?
Yeah.
Right. There comes a time when your body is going to either force you to go to the bathroom, right? You can only hold it as long as you can hold it, right? The same is true of psychological trauma. So our cops are drinking trauma through a fire hose. And at some point, you're going to have to go to the bathroom, so to speak. It's a normal bodily function. Just like you drink a lot of water, you got to go to the bathroom. You're navigating a lot of trauma. You're going to have to disposition that in some sort of way because it builds up over time. There is nothing that I've talked about so far in relation to the brain or the symptoms or indicators that can't be undone, that can't be reversed. What I know to be true, though, is that every cop, the cornerstone of our profession is you guys are problem solvers, right? That's what you do all day long. But you can't solve a problem that you're not aware of. Can't solve a problem that you don't know exists. So if you recognize you're hypervigilant, if you recognize your memory sucks, if you recognize you're having impulse control issues, then that's a step in the right direction, because now you can move forward and try to make it better, try to solve that problem.
Thank you. I think that laid it out really well for our listeners. A couple of questions, because I know it gets thrown out and I think people nod their head, right? We don't like to raise our hand and say we don't know something. I think that's why I was afraid to answer your water question. I thought it was a trick question, so, but go into, people talk about EMDR, or they talk about, RTI therapy. Can you talk a little bit about what those are so people maybe can understand what that does a little bit and how that can help?
Sure. So, you're running from call to call to call. Let's say you're a beat cop. Emotions get in the way of you being able to function properly, right? You can't halt and mush every time you do a death notification, so on and so forth. Your officer safety, is not going to be good, and then you're not going to provide the best service that you can. So you are trained. There's a lot of intention in the academy. We train you to put your emotions away, put them away. But just because you put them away doesn't mean they go away. So there comes a time when you have to kind of take the lid off and navigate it, whether it's because you recognize that it's time or because your body tells you don't have a choice anymore. Right? Maybe you are suffering at work and you're starting to get in trouble and things like that. One of the things that EMDR, narrative therapy, the kind of evidence-based practices that we know work for law enforcement, how that works is by sort of taking out that trauma, that incident, those emotions, and allowing the cop to process them in session so that it doesn't become something that haunts you at night. What happens when you put your emotions away but you don't process them is that's when you start getting intrusive images, because your brain's trying to process what you dealt with, by the way, which only happens when you're trying to relax, right? As soon as you go home and you're ready to, put on your slippers and watch TV, that's when the brain says, oh, remember that barrette, or, oh, remember that smell, or, oh, remember that thing, because your brain's trying to process, but you typically try to push that away because now you've got 30 minutes to relax, and that's not the time you want to spend dealing with all this stuff. So what happens is that those incidents, those emotions start to have control over you. They start to come when it's not convenient. They get in the way of you when you're at your son's first birthday party and all you can think about is that kid you couldn't save. It becomes intrusive and unwanted. What we do when we're doing EMDR, narrative therapy, and so on is we're giving you that control back. There are processes by which we bring that trauma, that incident, that image to the front and center of your mind, and we walk you through processing it so that it's no longer something that haunts you in the middle of the night or takes you away from your kid's birthday party. It's something that you can contend with and navigate in a constructive way, not just find your way out of it through a bottle or other means.
Very good. Well, thank you for explaining. I think that helps a lot of people get a better grasp of what these are and these availability for them to get help. So let's get into the second semester as Dr. Lee takes us to school. But what is stress? What is trauma? What is moral injury? Let's talk about some of those key words and actually some buzzwords now that are out there and floating around, just so we can help educate the listeners a little bit about what we're actually talking about.
Sure. So stress is the impact that an external or internal cue has on you as a person. So stress can be positive or negative, right? You're having a new kid, that's stressful, but somewhat positive, some might say. But you're still experiencing a physiological reaction to it, right? Maybe you're nervous, maybe you're worried, maybe your heart rate's increasing, and so on. Stress can also be negative. Maybe you have a bill to pay and you overspent last month. Maybe you're stressed about your kid getting bullied at school. Maybe you're stressed about work. So same kind of impact, your heart rate increases, right? You have some biological reaction to it. Stress is absolutely necessary for humans to perform and is a good thing when it's maintained and contained and dealt with correctly. Everybody deals with stress. It's a good thing. If not, we wouldn't save money to pay bills, right? We wouldn't be stressed out and worried about it. Trauma is when you are exposed to a situation that threatens your bodily integrity, your spiritual integrity, that of somebody whom you love or care about. You almost die. You learn of somebody you love or care about almost dying. Trauma is stress to the nth degree, but the impact is similar in that it causes a biological reaction. Trauma, like we talked about the brain and how it impacts the brain, it also impacts your autonomic nervous system. It impacts your breathing. And so trauma tends to live in the body as symptoms. There was a moment a couple of years ago where a friend of mine, Sergeant, was working patrol, and he called me and he said, "Hey doc, you got a few minutes?" And I said, "Sure." So I met him at a coffee shop, and full uniform in his patrol car, having a full-blown panic attack and wasn't doing very well. And he had been to the doctor in the ER 5 or 6 times in a month and a half because he thought he was dying. There was nothing physiologically wrong with him, if you will. It was all trauma related. Trauma lives in the body. I think that's something that your folks need to know. Moral injury are the traumas that cut deep. So moral injury is when there's an experience that maybe there were 2 victims and you're one person and you had to choose who to render aid to. Although you saved a life, you're not going to feel good when somebody calls you a hero because you had to make a decision. Moral injury, it shouldn't have been that house. It shouldn't have been that family. I should have stopped it. It's sort of that extra layer that we add on ourselves about what we think should have happened or how we should have performed. When I do critical incident stress debriefs, I tend to get brought in for like the really kind of ugly stuff. I debriefed a case where a child torture case, lots of videos and really kind of ugly stuff. Most anything having to do with kids is a moral injury because they are true innocents. We can't really understand why somebody would do X, Y, or Z. So there's stress, which is normal and reasonable if it's contained. There's trauma, which can hurt and can become problematic, again, if you're not aware of it and you're not implementing tactics to mitigate it. Moral injury are the things that we carry with us throughout our careers, sometimes leaving us in a position, maybe losing faith, maybe finding faith. I mean, those are the things that really impact us on a different level.
Thank you. I know you go around the country and you speak on several different topics. One I just listened to recently is you spoke with a gentleman, a young man, a detective, and you kind of just talked through that experience. Can you share some highlights of that presentation a little bit? I think it's important that our listeners hear just the great work you're doing. And then after that, we'll get into what it is to have an embedded clinician, what that looks like. And then, we'll finish up a little bit about resiliency and what is resiliency and how we believe we have to build proactive resiliency, not right after an event, but actually building up that skill set and building up that immunity prior to an event. So kind of just straighten the back. I know I gave you a lot there to digest, but go back to the presentation. I met the young man. I'm not going to say his name, but I met the young man, and your presentation is very impactful. Talk a little bit about that and why you felt it was necessary to go around and speak about this experience.
Sure. So this was a gentleman that I had met at a critical incident stress debrief after a line of duty death and wasn't doing that well, wasn't doing that great. Found his way to my private office a few weeks later, and we did some really hard work together, a lot of trauma work. He was a SWAT guy, narcotics detective, sex crimes detective, tip of the spear kind of folk. He was really struggling for a long time, and ultimately we made the decision that he was going to medically retire from law enforcement. Full PTSD, right? Now we're talking about paperwork, full PTSD retirement. So far in my career, he's been the only cop that I've medically retired. What he has done is really taken this experience and tried to make it something that he can use to pay forward. He has a lot of friends that are still, in the profession, in the organization he worked in and elsewhere. And part of healing, especially for law enforcement, is helping others, right? That doesn't go away. Just because you're not wearing a badge doesn't mean you're not still of heart and mind and service oriented. So he and I actually, in my home agency, I lead our wellness team and peer support team. And so I had him come in and brief our team on his experience going to therapy. It was his suggestion, his idea, and he did a phenomenal job and really connected with the hardened folks on our team, the SWAT guys and so on and so forth. So he and I were talking and he said, Doc, I'd love to do this again. I said, well, there's a conference coming up. Let's sign on the dotted line. If you're saying yes, we're doing it. We didn't practice. I mean, we talked about our slides and what I was going to talk about, what he was going to talk about. But I think there's immense value in having he and I both talk up there. So he went through his experience and his career and his incidents. We talked through when we met, what that was like for him. We talked through what about the way that I work made it comfortable for him because he had never been to therapy before to come in and talk with me. And essentially, I think the way he phrased it was, we had an initial crisis phone call for a couple of hours. What he said was, if I had told him everything was going to be okay, he would have never come in my office because that's bull. How do I know, right? But I think I told him, if you want to fix it, let's get to work. And he said, okay, I can do that, So presenting that experience, and he's doing great now, phenomenal, I think was really impactful for the audience because I can say all the things and it can be the smartest you've ever heard, but I've never done the job, right? So somebody might be able to hear that from the guy I spoke with. He does the job. Now, vice versa, the deputy might have all of the right things to say. However, people know too much about him or, he doesn't have letters after his name. He's just a cop. What does he know? And so folks are going to hear it better from me. And what's important, I think where he and I both align, is that the message needs to land and get across. And so that's why we did it together. I think it landed really well, and we're hoping to do it again in the future. But definitely something we hadn't done before. Wasn't exactly sure how it was going to go, but it was a success.
As someone in the audience and listening, it was impactful. And I think you're right. I think sometimes it's not about the message, but the messenger, right? Sometimes executives won't listen to officers, unfortunately, right? That's the people we should be listening to. And then I think some officers aren't going to listen to a clinician. So I think that kind of worked in and it blended well. I thought it was very successful. So thank you for being able to do that. And I encourage you both to continue to do that because, again, we never know the life that we're going to save. So that message may have, and very likely, changed an outcome. So I applaud you for having the courage to do something different, right? We're not just sharing a message, we're sharing something that can change a life. There's too many people out there that are out there sharing stories, but not actually making a difference. And there's a difference behind it.
Well, thank you. It's really thank you. It means a lot coming from you. I've been to many conferences, and too often somebody like me in a suit jacket and high heels or whatever goes up there and says, to be successful, you need 8 hours of sleep. You need to eat 3 meals a day. You need to breathe twice a day. You need to put your toes in the sand. You need to be filled with gratitude, not yell at your kid. Like, wellness isn't for me then, right? Like that's an impossible standard. And so I think that we in the healthcare profession and psychology in particular have sort of pushed away you guys to some extent on a grander sort of level, because what we told you is that wellness isn't for you. You got shift work. 8 hours of sleep every night isn't necessarily available. What I appreciate about the way that I present in particular, and the one that you're talking about, is there was no, here's what you should or shouldn't do. There was an explanation of the work that we did, why it worked, and sort of opened up the door, hopefully, to folks that are interested in getting better, show them that it's possible. We didn't set the expectations that are unreasonable. And so folks aren't even going to try.
Yeah, a good friend of mine, and this will probably be a small reveal as into the next guest, but John Kelly, a good friend of mine, who's doing the work and out there, he described it this: we all have the story, but does everybody have a message, right?
Mm-hmm.
A ton of people out there, LinkedIn heroes, I call them, all stars, whatever they are, social media influencers is really all they are, that share story. That's great. But what are we doing with it, right? And what message is there to gain from that? And what impacts will we make with this story when we're done with that? So we look forward to having John on. He's actually going to be our next guest. We talked a little bit about resiliency. So talk a little bit about what that means. It sounds great, right? And I think most people go, I'm a resilient person. But talk a little bit about what that means to be resilient and what do you suggest to the men and women that you work with?
Sure. I got to start with a story. So there was a guy in my office, and I asked him that question. I said, what is resiliency to you? And I'm thinking like, okay, this is a really profound question. This is a really smart dude. He's going to come up with something brilliant. It's going to change, we're going to turn the corner in therapy and, whatever. He sits there for a moment and he goes, I'm rubber, you're glue. Anything you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. Well, I guess sort of, kind of. Yeah, sure. We'll go with that one. My people. What are you going to do? But, resiliency is really training yourself to be ready for the psychological fight. Right? You train and you qualify and you do hopefully your Archon stuff and you work the mat and you train for the fight, the physical fight that you may or may not get into as an officer. What we're talking about in terms of building resiliency is developing tactics to do ahead of time so that when the psychological hits the fan, you rely back on your training and experience just like you would in a fight. So resiliency building can be anything really. Not everybody needs to go to therapy to be resilient. Maybe you stop surfing. You got to go back out and get in the water. Maybe resiliency building is holding on to those friends that are non-law enforcement. Maybe resiliency building is journaling or is therapy or is mindfulness. It's so individualistic and specific. What I will say is universal though, and this is something that I tell everybody that comes into my office is you shall start getting back in the gym. Working out is incredibly important. And there's a lot of good research actually that exercise can be more impactful than some antidepressant medication. And so talk about two birds, one stone, right? So you're working out, you're preparing for the physical fight and the psychological one. But sort of like we talked about with trauma, folks tend to feel like they're losing control. They're not in control of the thoughts and the feelings. Exercise is one way to get you back in the driver's seat. It pumps out all those good chemicals and feelings. It sort of flushes out all the adrenaline and cortisol and stress. So resilience is very specific to the person, I would say, outside of exercise. If there was one thing that I could mandate for all law enforcement across the country, it would be mandatory on-duty workout time and physical fitness standards.
I love it.
Before therapy, even. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. So, as we, move through these seasons and we start getting more towards wellness and organizational wellness and start focusing on that as leaders, I go around the country and ask people to raise their hand. How many people have on-duty workouts? You should see like the hands are starting to go up a little bit more than they used to, right? So that's good. But you still got some people that come up afterwards and work out on duty. Are you kidding me? But then they'll talk about all the other training they do. This is the most important training you do. So you're going to the range on duty, right? They're doing their DTAC on duty and a ton of other things on duty, but you're not going to allow them to work out on duty. And typically in law enforcement, firefighters, God bless you, you guys have been doing this for years and you get away with it. But for police, for some reason, it's been frowned upon. So it came into our situation here in my jurisdiction. And that was the question. It was like, why can the firefighters do it, but the police officers are frowned upon? The always answer was, what happens if they get hurt? Well, my response was, well, what happens when the firefighters get hurt? So, the risk managers all looked at me and no one really had an answer. And I said, well, if you can come up with an answer as to why firefighters can work out on duty and why police officers can't, then I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with this program. And that's basically how it happened. We just have to push back. We can't say no. We have to understand the importance, but we have to speak educational to the people that are unknown about these type of things and have some data base with you. I always say, if there's anybody out there that's interested in and needs some help, I'll send you a report. I'll send you our studies. I'll send you our staff report. Do the typical law enforcement and cut and paste your name into our name. Make sure you take all the panoles out of it and use it and say you developed it like we all do. So just reach out. There's resources for you to do that. But if there's one thing you can do that you're not doing in your organization right now, is to go and try and be an advocate for on-duty workout, because I think it's the one thing that really makes a huge difference in what we're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In terms of stress mitigation, working with trauma, moral injury stuff, the officer safety component. I mean, there's no reason not to, except for fear. We don't accept that, not in this culture.
Yeah. So the other thing that I advocate for is, and we don't have it here because we're a small organization, but how do we implement an embedded clinician? You're doing it at such a high level. There's tremendous benefits for your organization. Can you talk a little bit about that process for maybe people that are interested in trying to do that in their organization?
Sure. So my role in my organization is operational. So I supervise a sworn team, co-response teams. I do a lot of behavioral threat assessment and management. So for California folks, basically anything sub 422 kind of gets kicked over to my team and we deal with it. Do all the CIT training for the county and then also oversee our wellness team and peer support team. What I don't do for my organization is any clinical work. I don't see our deputies privately. I don't do critical incident stress debrief. I'm in critical incident stress debrief. So I'm embedded in a way that is fairly unique because I'm operational. I'm also on a crisis negotiation team. So every time there's a SWAT call out, I go out in the field and help gather information, give it to the guys that are doing the hard work. What I have found is when there are clinicians embedded within law enforcement organizations, generally it's for wellness. There's a benefit to that. And there's also some considerations to that. Oftentimes people don't want to connect with department psychologists because they're owned by the department. And so there's a lack of trust there. What I have found is that being embedded has gotten me in a lot of places I wouldn't have gotten to otherwise because of that trust, both operationally and clinically. Operationally, we're working with another agency in Riverside County. I want to look at the body cam from their high-risk felony stop because we're doing a threat case and I'm embedded at the sheriff's office. I can get that information, right? They don't have to vet me. My department already has. And so there's that continuity. With clinical stuff, I have a guy or gal in my office after a shooting, let's say. I get to share with them, hey, I was, as a part of my role as negotiator, I'm on scene. I'm in the car or in the vehicle, or I'm in the I'm not in the Bearcat. I'm on scene in our knock vehicle, or I'm at the CP, depending on the circumstances. And I have been on scene where there have been shots fired. I can understand the impact to a degree. I never have to contend with taking a life and don't pretend to. But there are some elements of what I do operationally that makes me better clinically. I think having an embedded psychologist to do one or the other is incredibly meaningful because if you think about it, when do you guys see somebody like me? There's two occasions generally. Pre-employment, where we as psychologists have power to give you a job or not, and fitness for duty, where we as psychologists have the power to take you away from your job or not. If that's your only exposure to somebody like me, why then, when you recognize some of those indicators are popping up, or you're dealing with moral injury stuff, why would you call somebody like me? If your impression is my job is to determine whether or not you can continue on in the profession. So having an embedded psychologist that does operational stuff or that does wellness stuff, what that does is it shows the troops there are other ways clinicians can be helpful to you, the person, or you, the organization. What I would caution agencies that are looking to endeavor into onboarding a psychologist, what I would caution you is vet your person. Like, cultural competency makes all the difference. You can have the clinician with all the letters, the best resume, all the training and experience you could want, but if they can't talk to your officers, then they're not going to make an impact. If they only answer the phone between 9 and 5, they're not available. If they don't know what an OIS is, that's a problem. And so there are clinicians that are specifically suited to work with first responders. Like I refer to myself as a police psychologist. I'm very proud of that. Not every psychologist has that credibility or that experience. Can that be learned and trained? Sure. So you find a psychologist or a clinician that you think might be a good fit, but they don't understand policing. You can teach them policing. As long as they're motivated and passionate, you can work with them. But if you don't have the motivation, the passion, and the competency, then you're kind of setting your program up for failure.
No, I think that's a huge point. And it's unfortunate our profession latches on to buzzwords. Culturally competent is becoming a buzzword, but it's so important and it's something we can't overlook. The other thing now, if you throw culture or the culture of an organization into your presentation topic, you're getting selected, right? It's so you have to know what people are looking for. You have to get the right buzzwords and then you'll be invited to some conference, right? But we have to, although we latch on to those and that's what our profession does and it goes in cycles, culturally competent is super important as we move forward in this space that you're talking about. So talk a little bit, I know we're getting close to time, but talk a little bit if you can about how these people that are having these mental health issues maybe navigate the workman's comp situation, if you can, only because our people are really getting a lot of pushback. Immediately you say I have a mental health issue and people are skeptical and they're getting their claims denied right off the bat. So I know it's probably more complicated. We may have to bring you back on, but can you talk maybe on the surface level, how maybe we give some tips to people that are going through that?
Sure. Generally speaking, my personal feelings about workers' comp can be summed up with, I think their motto is delay, deny until you die. So that is my personal experience navigating my private patients and the folks that I love and work with through workers' comp. It's just, I've never a good experience. I've yet to hear of that. So hopefully that's motivating to anybody in the workers' comp world. But, so workers' comp, you're filling out paperwork that's going to follow you. It's going to follow your career to some extent. It's really not a good idea to be making life-altering decisions when you realize that you're in the midst of your rock bottom. really not a good idea to be making, really big decisions about, are you going to tell the department or not, about, are you going to ask for time or not, or put in this claim or not, when your frontal lobe isn't working all that well and it's hard to concentrate and make decisions. So what I recommend folks do is get on the path to getting help, stabilize a little bit, and then start to make those decisions, because you don't want to move forward in a way that you can't take back. Now, workers' comp, in my experience, will sometimes buy back time. So what I do with my folks is they'll burn their sick time if they need to be off work for a bit, and then we'll file the claim and say, all right, pay my guy back his sick time. Here's the legitimacy of what we're dealing with and what we were navigating. So that's my recommendation to folks, is get right first. But workers' comp can be a whole trauma in and of itself. This happens with physical injuries too, but sometimes the difference is, let's say you were in a fight and you come in the next day and there's a cast around your wrist. What do people know? You were in a fight got physical, and you got bent, and you needed to go see a professional to help you heal. Right? Let's say you're in that very same fight, but the injury was to your amygdala or your hippocampus or your frontal lobe. And you walk in the room the next day, nobody knows that you're hurting. Nobody knows that you're getting help. That is often where the stigma comes from, just because if we can't see it, how do we believe it? So we transpose that idea into the workers' comp world. Like, you've got to fight and prove that you're messed up. I mean, that's just so backwards in my mind. It's just so backwards.
Yeah. I'm hoping with more experience, more exposure, the workers' comp people will start understanding a little bit better, a bit better comprehension. Again, maybe we'll get some people in there that are culturally competent. So I pray that's one area where we see a lot of improvement for our people. I really do, because it can be traumatizing. And really, when they go through that process, they're just done. They're raising the white flag. I'm done. I can't deal with this anymore. So the last thing we want is the process to cause more trauma into something that they're already facing. So thank you for sharing that. I think that will help some people. We're getting ready to done here. So talk to me about what's next for you, and give us some maybe last thoughts and where people can find you.
Sure. What's next for me? It's funny you say that. My kid just graduated first grade yesterday. So what's next for me is trying to balance summer. Good God. Why are the summer camps between 9 and 3? Who looks between 9 and 3? Right. So what's next for me is navigating 3 months of, oh my God, my kids are home. But I suppose you meant that in like the career sense. So I love my job. I love what I do. I am so blessed to be where I'm at. What I want to continue doing is sharing the message and doing the work and making an impact. I like to say, like, my 2 babies are officer wellness and behavioral threat assessment and management. So if I can be a voice for clinicians that want to enter that space and inspire some clinicians to want to come on board, become culturally competent, and work in the space, like, that's great. If I can make an impact and help prevent violence, if I can make an impact and help prevent another officer suicide or help save a marriage or whatever the case, like, that is a very good use of my time. So what's next for me is keeping on. Like, I'm really satisfied with where I'm at right now. There was a second part to your question, but I got taken away.
I think I was just asking, where people can find you, if they can reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am fairly prolific on LinkedIn. I think we're coming full circle now with that quote that you opened up with earlier. But, at the risk of sounding like an influencer, send me a message. If DM me, right, is what they say, I guess. If there's a question that you have, or you want to consult about something, or you want to steal the policies that we created at my agency and put your name on it, right? I have had folks reach out in various ways from all across the country because they read an article that I wrote, or they heard a podcast like this. So I really do try to make myself available. So I would say LinkedIn, and then, at the risk of sounding ego-driven, if you Google me, you'll find my email address and the agency I work for and so on as well.
Very good. And any last thoughts?
Just let's go. Like, let's change the culture. Let's do this. Like, let's make things better. I mean, like, cops are incredible human beings. There is no profession that I think is more full of valor and honor and awesomeness. And you guys really do give it all you've got. I think the least we in the healthcare profession and in the psychology world we can do is give you all we've got. So I think there's been, since you and I met, there's been a lot of forward movement and a lot of traction. We are nowhere where we need to be, but I appreciate that there are champions like you helping to move the needle. Let's do it.
I'm with you. So as we close out, I think you hit on something, and I have to say that if there's listeners out there, if your leaders are not telling you you're appreciated, needed, and wanted, the two of us are right here today to tell you you are, and we appreciate you and appreciate the work that's being done. I think we can come together and make policing great again. I really do. I think we're in the right move now and we're swinging in the right direction. So before we leave, I'll just say join our Six Pillar Podcast family by following us on your favorite podcast platform. I'll also mention that we are getting to the point where we will be looking for future sponsors. So if you're interested in sponsoring an episode or being a sponsor for this show, please reach out to our team at TechNA Innovations. And remember that one person can change the world, right? Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, they could change the entire world. Don't think that you can't sit back where your organization and change the culture of your organization, because you can. I'll end with this. Until next time, stay safe, healthy, and resilient, and God bless. I look forward to the next episode.
We extend our gratitude to Chief Neil Gang and Dr. Cherylynn Lee for leading us through this exploration of wellness and leadership for our extraordinary first responders. This is Cherylynn Finstad signing off on behalf of TechNA Innovations and the Six Pillar Podcast. Be safe, and thank you for joining us.